Welcome to Cool Explorations. I'm your host, Tony Peters. Yesterday we heard David Pollendine of International Justice Mission, or IJM, talk about what IJM does, some of the work that he does with IJM, and how God is really using him and using IJM to make a difference in the world and impact areas that need impacting. And part of the statement that they like to make is from the Bible, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Here is the second part to that interview.
Now, we did this beautifully in the Philippines with sex trafficking. Sometimes it's called sex tourism, isn't it? Where people will go there, and it was a horrendous situation where we had so many minors, so children under 18 in the sex trade, working in brothels, and it was just open season. Everyone knew it was happening. But everyone just thought it's too powerful. We can't go into the red light districts. These people, they're all connected. It's too dangerous. They're too powerful. There's nothing we can do. Well, we were able to secure a grant actually from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They were trying to deal with the issue of sexually transmitted diseases, and they felt that what we were doing was a kind of a fit. So they were willing to support us to go in and to do some investigations on. It was actually called Project Lantern, and we went in and working with the local police, local investigators. We actually then we started with a prevalence study, and so that meant sometimes investigators going in and doing face recognition. Some of these guys are just so good at being able to remember names and faces, and they would sometimes go in covertly under kind of, and they would find out who's where, how old they are. They'd find over a period of time. And so we then were able to start actually arresting. And so for a period of 2 years prevalence and then 2 years of arresting. And we thought we had a measurement. One of the measurements was when you got off a plane, got into a taxi, it would take you about, I think it was like 1 hour to find somebody who was a minor in the sex industry. It'd take you 1 hour.
Wow.
And oftentimes the taxi driver might be involved in that as well, because they'd see you're a Westerner. They'd think, okay, I know, I'll take them to this place and we can. So that was one measure. So that was one way we could measure. Okay, we looked at that when we'd done the arrests and things. Now we thought we were going to see a 20% decrease. That was our goal, was to say, look, to the government, we can work with you, work together. We'll see a 20% decrease after 4 years of doing arrests and stuff. And we worked in Manila. We worked in the red light districts, the areas Manila, Cebu, Pampanga. So worked in the areas which were the toughest areas, where there was impunity, like they were just getting away with it. There was no law. There was obviously corruption going on within higher levels as well. So, and actually, to our amazement, in each area we saw around 79 to 80% reduction in minors after we'd done those arrests. And so and the same happened to us in Cambodia, and that showed us that theory of change was true, that most people actually are doing it because they get away with it.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily doing it because they're hardened. I mean, they're still wrong. I mean, they still go down, and their sentences the same as anyone else. But often it's kind of human nature. They think, well, we'll get away with this. We're going to make loads of money on this, and so that's how it kind of spreads, And so you start arresting people. Now, a trafficker in the Philippines will get 40 years in prison, and it is 40 years.
I wish here in the States or States and Canada we did the same thing. Yeah.
It's 40 years. So, it's a deterrent. And so once somebody got convicted, that was it. Others were like, wait a minute, let's think about this. Do we really want to go to prison for this long? And so, yeah, it's been incredible. And what happens is it builds a pride actually within the police, that they're, and there are many great police who want to do the right thing. And often it's resources that kind of stop that from happening. Sometimes people aren't getting paid their wages, and so they have to find other ways, which aren't always the right way. but I think in that context, and so we've now got a wonderful, unit focused just on OSEC and our, just on working in sex trafficking. And so, yeah, it's just that was a real example of where you can see the deterrent of the law can have a massive impact where you've got impunity. And so, yeah, it can work really, really well. And we've seen that again and again in many different contexts. So, but it has to the government, we can't do this without partnership. It's got to be done in partnership. And 90%, 96% of our staff are from the country. We don't know, we go in, we don't know the law, we don't know the language, so it's not like we're going in and doing the work. No, we're having to work with the experts in that country. And there are many highly skilled people in aftercare and social work, in the police and investigation, in the judiciary. I mean, there's not a lack of talent. And so it's just directing, the people to be able to, it's development work, to be able to find the solutions and help themselves in that situation.
Yeah, and it's funny
Yeah,
how God kind of just lines up these people and kind of brings them together so that you guys can work together and finding the right people. I mean, it's like what I say with my own work. I can't take credit for it. I mean, it's just yes, we do hard work, but God has to bring these right people into the right places. So it's interesting to see that.
totally. And that is it. I mean, I've heard Gary Hagen talk about this, that often you're always looking for the people that are on your wavelength, that get what you want to do. And, sometimes it's just a case of finding the right people within each of those areas, within the investigating, within the judiciary, and they're there. And once you find that, then you've got synergy and you can actually do stuff. So sometimes it's just working with a police unit, who are just with what you're doing, and you then present to them the problem, and then you go and deal with it. And once that starts to work, it benefits everybody. I mean, everybody feels good about what they're doing. The perpetrator gets sent to prison. That's a good thing. The victim now doesn't feel they're going to get victimized again by the perpetrator, and it's closure for them as well. I mean, it just helps everybody, So it has to be seen, I think, and that's really important, that it's seen. And once you have that visible, you see that visible example, that model of how it can work, then people start to have faith and say, you know what, I'm going to trust, and I'm going to be willing to testify because they did it, and look what happened to them. And it builds confidence, it builds resilience within the system, which is what we want to do. Because at the end of the day, it's about protection. We want to protect people actually from getting abused in the first place. If you've got a strong system in place, a strong, a system of law, then you're actually protecting loads of people that would otherwise be, would be open to abuse.
Yeah, which is part of the reason why I like your aftercare programs that you guys have for people who've gone through this. So, because there's a lot of mental trauma and physical trauma that's gone on. So having that aftercare is definitely key, as well as being able to
Yeah.
give them a kind of closure and bring them into a right place. And in many cases, price is going to be involved in that whole process. I know not everybody's going to be receptive to the word of God, but in many cases, that is something that people will find comfort in.
Yeah, and when we talk about rescue, we've got a bit. I don't know. We've got a big campaign next month in November looking at trying to raise rescues for online sexual exploitation of children, particularly in the Philippines. But whenever we use the word rescue, we always say rescue from an initial investigation to immediate aftercare. We kind of have that as the same sentence, because the trauma starts at rescue. The trauma informed care, if you've not got the social worker there, the aftercare expert at the point of rescue, you don't get a case, because the first thing you have to realize is you're dealing with the victim of trauma, and someone who's in trauma can behave in a very different way than they normally would. And so unless you recognize that It's very hard, just simple things, just to get a statement off the victim as to what happened. That can be very problematic. And unless you get a good statement, it's not going to hold up in court when you go to court. And so oftentimes that's a big problem, where maybe the police force aren't trained in that. And so they won't get a good statement. And then when it goes to court, it just gets thrown out because it just seems like, well, this isn't very, it doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
So the aftercare worker is so key. From the moment we do the rescue, they are there. They're the first people. They're the first responders. They have to be there to help negotiate with the police, with the lawyer as well, to be able to say, okay, will this hold up in court? Do we need any more information? Do we, it's very practical, but it's really important. So
Yeah.
they're really key. Yeah.
Well, and for someone who comes from a youth care work background, like myself, the police aren't trained
Mm.
oftentimes in any of this stuff. There are some who do have some of that, but for the most part, they aren't trained in how to deal with that stuff, which is why
Yeah.
they rely on the social work system. But I know in many countries, like our own, the social work system is so overworked. I do have cousins on my wife's side. They are social workers, and they are very overworked. They have a
Yeah.
huge caseload, and so I that could definitely be a hindrance. But that's where I love having your kind of aftercare program that IJM has, and how Christ is using that to really try and bring the healing as well as judgment down on some of these people who are involved in this industry. Uh, do you see a lot of local resistance usually in the area, or is usually the local community pretty supportive of what you're doing?
Well, community is an interesting one. So, each crime type is slightly different. So it depends on the kind of casework we're doing in the country. But for example, again, if going back to Uganda, the crime of land theft, property theft, which again, I mentioned Boaz in the Bible, and the idea that they wanted to keep that Naomi married Boaz and they wanted to keep it in his name, kind of thing. The victim can go to court and can be proved right, and the perpetrator could be sent to prison for what happened. And then the victim can go back to their home and then be re-victimized by the community because they brought shame on the name of their husband. So sometimes not sometimes, you can't do the work without working with the community. It has to be a part of the work we do, because it just won't work. And so, yeah, in Uganda, we do lots of work on the ground with the community, working with the elders and the chiefs, because you need them on your side when you're doing this, when you're actually trying to bring somebody to justice. That forcibly. The thing is, again, this is the other thing, that in many countries the law is there. It's not like we're trying to create a new law. It's written there. It's just not enforced. It's just because what will often happen is they'll just say, oh, that's a cultural thing, that's something they deal with within the village, we're not going to get involved in that. That's something they'll do with that. And so it just doesn't get investigated by the police because they just think, well, it's not for us to do, it's for them, it's their thing, it's their community, they'll deal with it. And then they deal with it in their own way. So the elders, the chiefs of the village are really important, of the community, to work with them, to get them seeing that what's happening is wrong. And actually it's economically wrong, because it's not a good economic model to throw a woman and her 10 children, let's say she's got 10 children, and often the families are quite big, to become landless, to become beggars, because without land, you've got no food, because people grow their own food.
Yeah.
So you lose your land, you lose everything. And so suddenly now you've got 10 people literally begging. How's that helpful? And I think people see that, and people see that it's not a good way. Now, interestingly, one of the elders, this was in Uganda, said this was not always the way. It's not, so it's not even a cultural thing in some sense. It's the influence of globalization and greed, that people see that there's money and they want to seize the money. So one chief in one of the interviews we did with the people there said, actually, the widow was protected and she would be looked after and the children were catered for when that happened. But nowadays people are greedy, and so it's not happening. So I love that, because you can draw people back to actually their roots and say, this wasn't, if you've got an elder saying that, this isn't always the way it was. We need to get back to how we used to do this. I think that's a great model. But yeah, so community is really, really important. You've got to, and I think we've also seen within the work that we talk about the judiciary, we talk about working with the aftercare workers, we talk about working with the investigators, but we also need community involvement. We need people who are advocates in the community as well, and that's really helpful when you have those community advocates who are actually explaining. And that's the other thing, like when we used to do the arrests in Uganda, you'd have to explain to the community what had happened, because if you didn't, a different story would be told, and usually it would be, what would happen is the perpetrator, who would go to prison for say a year, would disappear, then come back and you say, oh no, I went on holiday for a year and I've just come back. And so they could create any story. And so actually what would happen is we would actually get a paper and we would get people to write. We'd have this story of what happened, and we'd get the victim to sign it, we'd get the perpetrator to sign it, to say yes, this is what happened, and we'd get the community leaders to sign it as well, so everybody could see that this is what happened, and if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And so that's really been helpful as well. And then within the community, we've got widow groups now. So we've got groups of women who've lost their husbands who form a cooperative group. Then they can share, they can make things, they can sell it, they can make an income from that. Sometimes as well, when there was court things, they would actually be with each other. They'd go in groups to the courts and support one another. So there's all that support stuff within the community, which is really key as well and really important. So yeah, community is key in every situation.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see that, and that bond kind of forming, and we see the same with a lot of prison ministries use that same model, which I love that that God is working in that way again to bring people together and form these communities and groups to work together.
Yeah.
How do people go about supporting IJM? I know they can go to www.ijm.ca, but how do they go about actually supporting you?
Yeah. I mentioned just briefly that we've got, so we, the biggest gift we can give from our context here is a financial gift, because the money that we have goes a long way in those economies, far longer than if it was obviously it's, it goes here, but in those contexts. So a lot of what we do is about sharing what we've got with others that don't have. So I think that's probably, that is a key premise of what we do. So I know next month, for example, we have we've got a campaign on OSEC, which is the online sexual exploitation of children, which is something which is new. It's a new crime which came about because of the internet, and so we're trying to put on rescues for that. So really simple way of doing that is you can go on to, actually we've got a particular URL. It's igm.ca/free, and you can go on there and you can give a one-time gift, or you can be a regular giver. We have a Freedom Partner program, so that's a monthly gift. But for example, a rescue costs, to put on a rescue from initial investigation to immediate aftercare, it costs $10,900. It's not cheap.
Yeah.
But you can break that up. So as part of that rescue, one rescue kit. So every child gets a rescue kit when they're rescued: toothbrush, toothpaste, towel, basics, hygienic stuff. One rescue kit, $25. So if you break it up, a trauma-focused therapy session, $100. So within that, you can give smaller gifts. You don't have to give one big gift. You can sponsor a survivor in a primary school for $400. So there are lots of ways of doing that. If 10 people signed up for $100 a month, or even 9 people, that's a rescue every year. So I think you have to break it up and see, actually, this is how we can use what we have. Sometimes we give, we give out of what we got. Not everybody's got the same amount, but it's something that can really make a massive difference in that context. So www.igm.ca/free would take you to that opportunity to give. However, um, we also need to talk about these issues. Slavery doesn't get talked about enough,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there are many people who actually don't know that slavery exists today, because their image of slavery is the transatlantic slave trade. It's the image of the African being taken from West Africa to the Americas, to the Caribbean, and being used to pick cotton or sugar or whatever. The reality is, slavery's become, well, it's far greater than it ever was. And I don't know if you've heard the recent statistics. There's like a 10 million increase in slavery in the last 5 years. So the measure, before, we were measuring from 2017 and before, and it was 40.3 million people in slavery. Since 2017, they've just done another measure in 2000 and just recently, and they're now saying it's actually 50 million.
Wow.
So that is a jump, and that's down to three things. It's down to COVID because of lockdowns. It's down to climate change because you've got displacement of people from the land, so they become migrant workers and they're vulnerable to slavery. Also, a lot of the climate change, a lot of the industries that destroy the earth are mineral extraction, gold, farming. It's all the things that support slavery. So
Yeah.
climate
Cell
change is
phone stuff is
it's a big
bad.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a big one. So yeah, you've got these challenges at the moment. So we need to talk about it. We need, for it not to be a taboo subject, to talk about sexual exploitation, to talk about um, slavery. It is actually very shameful that we're all connected. We can't be sure where our clothes come from. We don't know that there's not slavery attached to the things we wear,
Yeah.
to the makeup we put on, to the things we drink, everything that supports our Western lifestyle could well be touched by slavery. So we've got to get a bit more active in looking at that. And so I think just raising awareness. You can go online. We've got social media. You mentioned LinkedIn, and we've got same on Instagram and Facebook, where you can just share stories. Just if there's a story about a rescue, about a prosecution, about whatever, just share it and just have a little comment. It's always good to put a comment on the share as well,
Yeah.
because people are more likely to read it. But just give your opinion on what you see. And I think sharing those things, obviously from IGM, but there are other organizations that do the work that you can share from as well. And I think just getting people talking about it and just being more aware that there are modern day forms of slavery which dwarf the slave trade from the transatlantic times. I mean, there are way more people now in slavery because of what's happening through lots of different types of slavery, which continue to happen because they're profitable, because they make
Yeah.
loads of money. And so, all of the garment industry, um, it could be, it could be something with farming. It could be to do with sex trade and I think trafficking is $150 billion industry. Sex trafficking.
Yeah.
$150 billion industry.
Yeah.
You can see why it thrives.
Yeah, and
You
the,
can
the
see.
tech industry is a huge part of that. And a lot of
Yeah.
the materials that go into making computer chips and
Yep.
the materials for your cell phone, as I brought up before, and
Yep.
laptops and stuff like it. So
Yep.
much of that technology, that the material for it,
Yep.
it is mined by slaves, and
Yep. Yep.
and many of them are children,
Yep.
and many of them die during that
Yeah.
process. So it
Yep.
is definitely something that we need to talk about and be aware of. And
Yep.
it's something that as Christians, we need to be really mindful about what we're supporting
Yeah.
and that.
Yeah. So thank you, Tony, for this podcast, because this is part of that talking, having that conversation, getting it out there, talking about these things are really key. And actually, that has to happen before we can pray. We can't pray unless we know what we're going to pray about. So I think it's really important we do that talking part, we do that sharing, we've got the power of social media to share this stuff, and for good, is there. So we should be doing that. But then, of course, we've got that ability that we can actually then pray about it as well as Christians and as churches. So another thing that we do is called Freedom Sunday, which churches can get involved in as well. Actually, they can put on a Freedom Sunday and they could focus on a particular issue. So again, they can go to, we've got a link, www.igm.ca /Freedom Sunday. So that's another opportunity that a church could, and we would help supply the church with, resources and stuff, stories, videos, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just good to be proactive and to take the initiative to do these things. Once you hear it, I mean, Wilberforce said, didn't he? Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once you saw the slave trade, you can't unsee it. And I think we've got to be prepared to see these things. The temptation, and I get the temptation, I get it, because it's saturated by bad news. The news is just full of tragedy. And so I get that can be quite heavy, to keep looking at. But once we've seen these things, actually, by being proactive, it can lift that feeling of oppression from us if we're actually doing something positive to help.
Yeah. And I love that on your LinkedIn, that with IJM, you see these stories of successes that have been happening. I do find those things uplifting because I'm like, that is God at work. Like
Yeah.
God is putting a stop to these wrongs that the devil has going on in our society. And part of that is a lot of them feel trapped. And what advice would you have for those who are feeling like that they're trapped in these situations that they can't get out?
Yeah. And I mean, even not limiting that to slavery, just to violence. I mean, we also within Uganda actually we kind of have now a bigger focus, and the focus now is violence against women and children, and that's become quite. We do the same in Latin America because it just covers more things.
Yeah.
I mean, one is intimate partner violence is a big issue in actually both in Latin America and also in Uganda and other countries, and in the West as well. And I think often the reason that people are trapped is that nobody knows about what's going on. Now, sometimes that because there's just nobody that you can tell. Oftentimes, there are people you can speak to, you always take a risk, obviously, when you share things. So, you've got to be sensible. You don't want to make yourself more vulnerable in a situation. But if it's a desperate situation, I would say you just need to find someone you can share it with, share that information with. Because unless you do that, nothing will change. Unless you, yeah, you're trapped, and I think the other thing to realize, and I'm speaking really I'm not speaking from experience, so I want to put that up there as well. I kind of offer this advice slightly gingerly because who am I to give advice on this topic? But I think we always have a choice. We always have a choice, even if it's a hard choice. We do have a choice, and we've got staff who have actually lost their lives in this particular issue in intimate partner violence, and ironically the casework they were working with IJM on was intimate partner violence, and yet in their own home they were experiencing it because it was within the culture where that was prevalent. So I think it is a case of finding someone you can share that with, and maybe not. I think we all do this. We kind of take responsibility for what hasn't happened. We run scenarios in our head about if I do that, oh, then this will happen, and then that's going to happen. So I'm not going to do it. Even about little things, we do that all the time. I do
Yeah.
that all the time. I take responsibility for things that I've got no control over. So I think I wouldn't want to even start to create a whole plan about what you're going to do. I would just say, just do that first step of sharing with somebody what's going on, that you can trust in a safe space, and just see, very cautiously, but just see how that can actually progress. And there's strength with two. There is strength with two, and we know that from a Bible perspective, that
Yeah.
two or more, two or more, we have a strength. So I wouldn't want to offer any more advice than that, because I think it always depends on the situation, doesn't it, and the
Very
scenario that
much.
you're dealing with. But I think that is really key, because you're just if you have not shared it with somebody, you are so trapped, you're so alone. I mean, it just has an impact not just on your physical health, but on your mental health as well.
Yeah.
um, and often the abuse has been normalized. Often it's become almost a ritual. It's always become, something that people get used to. And they don't need to. Yeah.
Yeah. And you
um
never know how God's going to use that other person
no.
in your life. You never know until you take that, like you say, that chance, that risk. Um, and it is definitely, yeah, it's something that in the past we've seen success with, is just reaching out to someone, and that's enough that it just
Yeah.
snowballs into something that gets you out of that situation and
Yeah.
can give you hope. It can give you encouragement, uh, and strength.
Yeah. And that's often how we find cases. That's how we find our cases, because somebody comes up to us and says, I've got a friend and this is the situation, can you help them? So often that's what's happened. Somebody shared with somebody what's going on, and then they've come to us, and then they don't realize that actually, if they went through a kind of a sort of an official government system, because of the resources, because of lack of resources and things, they might not get the protection and stuff. But if they're going to do it through working with IJM, they're going to get protected. They're going to get all of the things that are needed to take them through the justice system. So they suddenly realize, oh, actually, it's not as big a risk as I thought it was, because I can get protected here. And actually, then that's why it's so important that the perpetrator is brought to justice, because unless that happens, there's a case in we had a case in, I think it was in Kenya. It's in Africa, one of our countries in Africa we work in, where the young girl walked to school, just like, she everybody walks to school. And one day on her way to school, a taxi, they call, I think it's a bodu driver. They drive motorbikes, but they taxi
Mm.
drivers on motorbikes. She was on her own, and he assaulted her, sexually assaulted her. She went to school, but from that moment on, she stopped talking. She lost her voice, and she stopped going to school. And everyone was wondering what's going on. Well, eventually it was realized what had happened. And one of the key things, I mean, this girl now she's now flourishing. She works, I think, as a hairdresser. She's got a salon. She's goes to church. She's got a leader in a youth group. She's now just talking again. She's come through it. But one of the big things for her was that the taxi driver got 10 years in prison. He got put in prison for 10 years. Now, he was doing that with impunity. He had no fear of the law, because
Mm-hmm.
normally he'd get away with it. Normally that wouldn't be but thankfully we picked up her case, and we were able to send him to prison, and that had an impact on the community. Now, if you don't do that, what happens is all the girls from the village stop going to school. So it doesn't matter, you talk about the development work, and this is how it's all related. We're so important that we have law, because if there's no law, if people are in fear of walking to school, then they don't get an education.
Yeah.
Or their fear of going to get water, they don't get water. It impacts everything of their lives if they can't trust in a justice system. So thankfully she got justice, and then that gave other girls confidence that, okay, I'm protected. It's not going to be just that, that if I go to school on my own and that happens to me, that I'm going to be left in my trauma and I'm going to be just useless, and have no justice, and I'm going to be in fear for my life, because we've been able to arrest the perpetrator and send them to prison, and the girl now is flourishing because of it.
That's
So yeah,
amazing.
it's so important. Yeah.
And God at work, just
Yeah.
I love that. And prayer is so key, as you mentioned before, to every step along that way. And even in our own things that we're doing and in our own life or in mission work or whatever, prayer is so key and central. And you can just look at it and be like, I see God at work right there, or I see that prayer answered right there.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing the work that you do and the fundraising and support that you provide for IJM. I love seeing how God's working in different people's lives and through different organizations.
Thank
So
you. Mm.
thank you guys for the work you do.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it. And thank you for what you do. I think you're doing a wonderful job. And yeah, keep it up. Keep sharing these stories and speaking with people that can inspire others. So yeah, appreciate what you're doing through your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Cool Explorations. You've just heard David Pollendine talk about IJM, or his International Justice Mission, which can be found at www.ijm.ca. And he's been speaking about how IJM has made a difference in the communities and around the world in really impacting the slave and sex trades and people from abusive situations, really helping them out. And God is really at work using this organization. If you would like to reach me for any reason, you can do so at tpeters745@gmail.com.